Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our next webinar in the series called Negotiating Digital Space in Culturally Significant Storytelling. In this series, we pose the opening questions. What role can digital storytelling play when contemplating the promotion and preservation of oral traditions of knowledge transfer? Can the digital create a parallel space for storytelling and its impact on the roles of the author, narrator, reader, storyteller, and storykeeper? What are the frameworks within which stories operate, and what happens when the digital tools are put to play? In the 7 sessions of the webinar series, these questions and others will be explored through conversations with invited speakers from diverse fields within academia and the industry. So today's session, which is called The Absence and Pluralities of Stories, and we welcome our 3 guests today, Mark Novo, Zoe Todd, and Monique Menage. And we are looking forward to this wonderful conversation that we are going to have with you. And as all of you know, stories can be sociocultural as well as a political tool that lend themselves to both pronouncing multifaceted dimensions and viewpoints, as well as to hiding and screening perspectives. So in today's sessions, Zoe Todd, joined by Monique Menage, discuss the institutions and strategies of absenting stories through digital storytelling, Algonquin sovereignty, and how this connects to Carleton's relationships to Rideau River and the Canal, while Mark Novo presents a plurality in the reading of stories embedded in archival drawings. Today, they will together discuss how absence and plurality are 2 sides of the same coin. And absence indicates an overlooked plurality, while a plurality probes for inherent absences. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome Katie to introduce our speakers today. And just before that, I would also like to thank our sponsors. So this series has been funded by a Shirk Connections grant, and we are supported by the Bachelor of Media Production and Design program, School of Journalism at Carleton University, and the Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College. So a big thanks to them from the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats. As well, we are supported by Art Engine and Carleton Immersive Media Studio here in Ottawa. So thanks to all our supporters and sponsors. This 7-part series will be running from June 16 to July 28th, and we look forward to seeing all of you in all of our series. Some of the webinars have been recorded and they're up for viewing on our YouTube channel as well. So without further ado, over to Katie to introduce our speakers.
Yes, thank you, Pallavi. So it's very exciting today. We have 3 different speakers and it's very different backgrounds too. So it'll be a very interesting conversation that comes out. I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to introduce all 3 speakers and then pass over the Zoom share screen function to Mark, who will begin to present. And then after his time, Zoe and Monique will present together. And then we will have a discussion curated by us, as well as any questions from the attendees. Please put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will bring them to the attention of the speakers. So first, I'd like to introduce Mark Novo. He is the head of the architecture program in the Design School of Arizona State University. In that role, he is helping to imagine what it means to be an architecture program within the model of the new American University. Novo's research explores the role of storytelling both in pedagogy and in practice. He is currently working on a digital archive of the work of the rhetorical architect Douglas Darden. He's the past executive editor in the biannual peer-reviewed Journal of Architectural Education. So welcome, Mark. And now for Zoe Todd. They are a practice-led artist research who studies the relationship between Indigenous sovereignty Sovereignty and Freshwater Fish Future in Canada. As a Métis anthropologist and researcher artist, Dr. Todd combines dynamic social science and humanities research and research creation approaches, including ethnography, archival research and testimony, and experimental artistic research practices within a framework of Indigenous philosophy to elucidate new ways to study and support the complex relationships between Indigenous sovereignty and freshwater fish well-being in Canada today. Monique Menach is a member of the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. Monique is a knowledge keeper working closely with Algonquin elder Albert Dumont. Currently, Monique is a student at Carleton University taking a doctorate program in anthropology focusing on the impact, use and creation of digital arts in the Indigenous community. Her master's degree is in Indigenous and Canadian Studies with a specialty in digital humanities. Monique also holds a postgraduate diploma in Indigenous policy and administration. And in 2004, Monique became founder and executive director of Indigenous Culture and Media Innovations, which is dedicated to the skills development of Indigenous women and youth through the production of media and arts. So welcome both Zoe and Monique. With that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand over control to Mark, who can begin. So please, Mark.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me? We good? Great. So first, just a quick thanks to everybody for pulling this together. I know it's the summertime and academics are usually in transit somewhere. So I'm excited actually to have the conversation. Our earlier conversation opened up a bunch of questions, and I actually think that's what this might do as well. I don't have a lot of conclusions. I have a lot of questions. And what I want to do today is present a short presentation, 20 minutes, in 3 parts, talking about sort of telling a bit of a story really about my own relationship, my own understanding with some work that I've been thinking about really since around 1994 or so. So to begin, I want to sort of posit a statement in a way. Maybe it will be a question. But one thing that I think we can agree on perhaps is that all cultures do 2 things. We all build and we all tell stories. And oftentimes those things are intertwined. Stories are told in time, buildings occur in time. Buildings and stories both help us define who we are. Stories are told from different perspectives. Stories are translated, buildings are translated. They really help to really construct our world in many ways, in fictional ways, but also in ways that are oftentimes very personal. So we often have a personal relationship with buildings. Buildings and stories both have intentions, but they're also both received, they're interpreted. So there's always space for misinterpretation, which can be a good thing. It can also not be a great thing. So I'm going to start with that, with the idea that building and storytelling are connected. The presentation is in 3 parts, and so I'll begin. Each part gets smaller and shorter. So if you're bored, that will help along the way. I'm going to talk about a project by the architect Doug Darden. Doug was an architect educated in the early 80s at Harvard GSD. He was originally actually a ballet dancer. He was a ballet dancer. He then went on to train as an architect, worked as an architect in New York, in Baltimore, then moved back to Denver, became a fellow at the American Academy, and then moved back to Denver, published this book, Condemned Building, in 1993, and then died 3 years later in 1996. Condemned Building is a book of rhetorical buildings. He named them as rhetorical projects. They were never intended to be built. They were, in fact, a building, a verb in themselves. They were not an analog to something in the world. They all have a lot of narrative references. The role of narrative in his work is super important, very present. So I think he's a good sort of person to talk about today, a good project to talk about. Condemned Building has 10 projects in it. Each project has a canon from architecture that is overturned. So for example, a monument is for remembering. The project Temple Forgetful posits that a monument is actually for forgetting. The project I want to talk about today is the Oxygen House. And the canon is that architecture, a house is for living, and he will posit that a house is in fact for dying. So I first came across this project in 1995. I was a student of architecture, and I was amazed by the book. It's a kind of incredible book, and I'll just show a few pages from the Oxygen House to tell you what the story, how the project was presented originally. So the first page gives you the title. It's the Oxygen House. The subtitle is a near triptych on the act of breathing. It's cited in Frenchman's Bend, Mississippi. There's a photograph of a model, kind of not super clear, and then the canon down below on the first page. The second page, we have a short description of the project, again, a photo of the model and another quote. All the quotes throughout the entire book are from Hamlet. And the project is about a house that was constructed for a railway worker who was walking home one day, and the train jumped the track, a piece of metal flew off, punctured his lung, and the house becomes a breathing device for this rail worker. And eventually he is entombed in the house. So the house transforms upon his death, and that's where he is finally buried. We're given instructions, really choreographed how the project works. All the projects in Condemned Building are very similar in the sense that they're very choreographed. And so on the left-hand side, we have a plan, which is the nurse's plan, which cites the project, and then a series of instruments. And then on the right-hand side, we have a letter to Darden, to the architect, Doug Darden, from a character named Brendan Abraham, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. That's the letter that in which he asks him to build the house. So a bit more detail. This is the site plan. The site is twisted, or rotated, I should say, 90 degrees. So north is to our left. And in the, sorry, one second. So the first line runs east-west, and that's called the life line. That has the ambulance that brings the Abraham to the house. It has a finite supply of oxygen running east-west. And then 45 degrees to that is a lifeline which contains 2 trees and crosses over the center of the house. Running north-south is the death line. That's the line that the rail track is on. And 45 degrees to that is a dried up wash. Vertical at the intersection of all those lines is a lift, and that's where the nurse who attends to Abraham goes up and down, and then the pit of the elevator is where in fact he's laid to rest. On vertical as well, just to the left of that is the oxygen supply. That oxygen supply goes up into the chamber where Abraham lays dying, and there's a small handle that he can operate, a mechanical piece at the top, which regulates the oxygen to air mixture so that he can in fact breathe. He lays dying on a chaise lounge, looking out of a ribbon window onto the horizon. The next page contains a few more model photographs, and then the discontinuous genealogy. So all the projects in the book have this discontinuous genealogy, and they're comprised of a series of objects which give metaphorical and formal import to the actual project. This has a Civil War engraving, a wash basin, a brake, Westinghouse brake, and a Zeppelin. Now, all those are put together, collaged together, and then give essentially the form of the building. And so we see the discontinuous genealogy on one side, and then the form of the building on the other. Next page includes an elevation, the west elevation, and then a collapsed lung, which is somewhat strange, but the collapsed lung is sitting there. That lung becomes important a little bit later on, so I'll describe what that is. Next page is a full spread of the model itself, and then a couple of elevations, and then finally the final operations, which describe what happens when Abraham dies. So once Abraham dies, his body is transformed from the top to the bottom. He's buried vertically in the elevator shaft, and then the tree, which was on the lifeline, is transplanted up to the top horizon. And the drawings themselves, which are actually quite large, are reproduced very small in the book. The left is the anatomical section, which is the life section. That is then recto verso for the post-mortem section, which is the death section. So that's the story of the project. And many, for many people, the idea that you sort of use the discontinuous genealogy to find the form of the building is totally understood. It's normal. It's where we thought the buildings came from. The references to Hamlet, the letter, all these things combine and really create a story which is in many ways very understandable, very clear, very cogent. However, when we look into the archive of his work, and he left a pretty amazing archive, the majority of that is in the Avery Library at Columbia. There's a number of Polaroids of this small building. It's an industrial building on the coast of New Jersey. And you can see the World Trade Center, the old World Trade Center in the back. So this building is on the coast of New Jersey. Doug was living there in the mid 80s. These photos were taken in 86 and 87. And he was amazed with this little building and this little industrial building. When he saw it, he was kind of blown away by it. And he said, what if, what if a building wasn't something that could sustain life, but what if it was something that didn't sort of, that you didn't need just to have, but it sustained your life? What if it was something that helped you breathe? And so in his text, in his notes from that time, he said, I started this project with a photograph of a little industrial building cast out in an open field. And this building itself literally becomes the oxygen house, right? So that drawing, this is the first drawing done in 1988, done over a couple of weeks, literally takes that industrial building from New Jersey and he redraws it in the center of it where the drum and the square meet is where, in fact, the man lays dying. And he's added in blue in back another form. And that form I'll talk about in a moment. But the drawing itself begins with that project, with that building. And you can see the structure at the base of the box. You can see the spiral staircase, the cylinder and the cube connected. He's literally redrawn this little industrial building and is finding new meaning within it. And there's a number of interesting sort of ideas. The building is already on a railway. It's on a wash. It has a kind of this constant duality between square and circle, one lung that's collapsed and one lung that works. It's sited in Ray, Arizona, originally. Ray, Arizona is a mining town. And it was interesting for Doug because it related to Raymond Abraham, the architect, as well as Ray Carver, the author. And there's a number of quotes throughout the building or throughout the drawings, which are kind of interesting. In this one, we see who today is able to record anything that comes across to us as a fact without causing deep injury to the image. And one could imagine him causing deep injury to this little building, but also sort of thinking about how we reference things. What is the nature of something? How do we use it in projects? Around the same time, Doug went back to Harvard and was sort of reminded of the Carpenter Center. He tilted the Carpenter Center plan up 90 degrees. That's where the second lung comes in. That's the plan of the Carpenter Center, these sort of two kidney-shaped lung shapes that are transposed onto the oxygen house. And prior to the final drawings, the lung is still there. The second lung is still there, but the oxygen room is getting a bit more similar to the final drawing. This is the final section. The lung itself moves down into the ground. There was always a subterranean quality to the project. And what he does here is he puts one underground and one essentially above ground, but in a further horizon. Around the same time, he rewrote the narrative of the project itself. And he said, in 1987, I took a photograph of a little industrial building cast out on an open field in the country just north of Oxford, Mississippi. Now, this is interesting because the project was never in Oxford, Mississippi. It was always in New York. Then it was sited in Ray, Arizona. And what happens is that in March 1988, Doug visits with a friend named Ben Ledbetter, who is from the South, went to school with Ben, and he told him about the project. And Ben said, have you ever read Faulkner? You need to read this. It's all about this. It's about the death of the South, and his project maybe was about the death of architecture. And so Doug read the book and completely shifted the project. So the first thing was that he cited it in Frenchman's Bend, which is in Yoknapatawpha County, which is where Faulkner set all of his novels. It's a fictional town of an actual county in Mississippi. So Faulkner creates this fictional county out of a real county, and Doug then situates the oxygen house within that site. And if we go back to the text, the letter that was sent, all of the references go back to As I Lay Dying. So Burden Abraham is a play on the family name in As I Lay Dying. And the story of As I Lay Dying is a series of chapters told by different characters, all about the death of the matriarch, Addie, of the family. And they're bringing her tomb to the cemetery across the state of Mississippi. The date is the 6th of July, which is when Faulkner died. 1979 is when Darden started his graduate work. And it took 3 years, which is the same time it takes to actually build the project. Abraham is working with a nurse, Sister Jewel. In the text of As I Lay Dying, Jewel is a boy. It's the brother of one of the characters. There's a description of a hair flowing a full head above his own in the dust. The tracks of the rail run straight as a plumb line, and his heart no longer goes chuck, chuck. And then there's a reference to Addie's curtains, which is the scene in the book of the casket itself. You see the casket through the curtains. And so the first chapter of Faulkner's As I Lay Dying is Darrell's chapter. It references Jewel, his brother, and Jewel's frayed broken straw hat, a full head above his own. The path that they walk to the casket is straight as a plumb line. And as they get there, their brother is creating the casket with an axe, and it's going chuck, chuck, chuck. So he's taking all these references from Faulkner to actually recreate this letter to a fictional architect. So all of that is sort of housed within the archive, and you can unpack all of the actual, quote unquote, actual story. But then there's a third story. And when Doug arrived to the academy in Rome, he had about 6 or 7 projects halfway completed. He went from 89 to 90, got back to Denver in 1990. He started working furiously to finish all the projects, and he felt exhausted. And he went to the hospital, and he was diagnosed with leukemia. So the photo of the lung in Condemned Building is actually his own chest x-ray. And the chest x-ray is done for patients to see the effect of the cancer on their body. And so he actually inserts his own lung into the story of the oxygen house. And in the correspondence from around that time, he says, I must tell you that when I designed Oxygen House 3 years ago, I had no way of knowing how autobiographical the project would become. I myself was diagnosed last year with a rare kind of leukemia that my doctor stubbornly and somewhat ruthlessly called terminal. I too am stubborn and ruthless, but on the side of life. According to 2 experts, I was supposed to be dead last January. I'm happy to have proven and continue to prove them wrong. So in this sort of very short presentation, I want to propose that the reality of this project has at least 3 pluralities, at least the one presented, the masked one perhaps, presented in Condemned Building, where we have a post-rationalized form through the discontinuous genealogy. We have a whole series of references that are there if you look, but if you don't know the references, they still hold up together as a cogent story. The second story is the story of the actual process of the building, where there are references, there are drawings, there are iterations of the project, things come and go, etc. And all of those are archivally can be sort of referenced. And then finally, there's the personal narrative of Darden and his own sort of dealing with life and death, which in some ways was not known at that point, though he had written prior to the project being complete that life is always present, and it's always like a diagonal line through our life, but we never want to really think about it. But the one thing that happens to all of us is that we die. It's part of life. So just to wrap up, to go back to this idea that all cultures build and all cultures tell stories, if we believe that all stories are plural and that plurality is a good thing, that maybe means also that buildings are all plural, and that's a good thing. However, it's difficult to believe that in our own cultural context today, in our own political context with everything that's happening. It seems storytelling has taken on this incredibly powerful new moment, but is it really, is it a positive thing? I'm not sure. So I want to put out a question about, is the plurality of storytelling a good thing? Whose story is it to tell? Is one story more valid or not? These are just some questions that, for me, this work is kind of unearthing within the context of our own political state. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was a very, very insightful, and within that limited time, I think it was very powerful, your presentation. So thank you very much for it.
Thank you.
And we'll pass on the space to Zoe and Monique. And over to you.
Thank you, Mark. That was so powerful, and you packed so much in 20 minutes. Actually, I'm going to start my timer so that Monique and I stick to our time. But just thank you. I have so many questions that come up after watching that, and just yeah. So Monique and I are joining you. Monique is on the road. And Monique and I are both Indigenous scholars connected to Carleton, and we have co-founded the Indigenous Environmental Knowledge Institute. I'm going to speak first, and then Monique's going to take the show and finish us off by discussing her amazing work. Yeah, I'm very grateful to join you here today from the unceded territories of the Snuna'as and Qualicum First Nations here on Vancouver Island. And of course, I work closely with individuals, including Monique, within the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin Nation, upon which whose territories Carleton occupies. And we're so lucky to work with Indigenous Algonquin scholars like Monique at Carleton within the Algonquin homeland. So this is just to kind of situate us, cite us, S-I-T-E. And Mark, as you were talking, I was thinking about the pluralities between citing, C-I-T, and citing, S-I-T-E, and how those sort of converge in architectural theory and in, I think, a lot of Indigenous work as well, where people like Vanessa Watts talk about Indigenous place thought, where you cannot take thought away from place because people and thought are co-connected and co-created. Citing and citing, the two of them come together in that way. So architecture is actually a really almost natural space to think with Indigenous cosmologies as well, because as you say, all cultures build and all cultures tell stories. So Carleton is situated within the Algonquin homeland. And I like to use this map in a lot of my talks just to sort of show how Algonquin communities coincide so closely with the Ottawa River watershed. And you can see here Kitigan-Zibi, Pegwaganagan, but also Monique's community of Barrier Lake further north. All of these communities have long historical relationships to the watershed and have built and told stories with and through these rivers and waterways since time immemorial. So that brings us to Carleton, which is situated between the Rideau River and the Rideau Canal. And it's kind of a very interesting place for Carleton to be at the confluence of, and thinking with what you just presented, Mark, sort of that idea of the lifeline. We could almost think of the Rideau River as a lifeline. It is one of these, Caitlin Tully has talked about the rivers of the Ottawa River watershed as the highways of the Algonquin Nation that people used for thousands upon thousands of years. But then you have the Rideau Canal, which is military infrastructure, which was built by the British in their efforts to assert their questionable illegal sovereignty over Algonquin and other Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee homelands. And you have the canal, and our colleague Catherine Bonnier has sort of done a lot of research on the building of the canal and talked about, I would think of it as a death line, but maybe not the kind of like beautiful death that Mark, you just sort of spoke about, this kind of rebirth and death kind of commingling, but a very imperial, colonial, extractive kind of death, where as Dr. Bonnier has shared with me sort of informally, I don't want to put her on the spot, but just about the number of laborers who died building the Rideau Canal. And so the Rideau Canal is a site of death, a kind of and not like acknowledged death, that every day we ride past this canal through Ottawa without realizing the sort of the imperial extractive deaths that inscribe it. And I kind of stumbled upon this by accident in 2016 in my second year of teaching at Carleton. I had my first grad seminar, and I thought it would be really beautiful to take students to the river and to the canal so that they could sort of understand the waterways that the university sits within. And so we first went to the river. Students remarked on how powerful it felt to watch the rapids just outside the classroom, and to experience kind of the life that they saw there, the animals, the plants, the movement. And then, and I couldn't have planned this. It was one of those sort of fortuitous, it was like something else was guiding us that day. I said, well, let's go look at the canal and contrast and compare what it's like to sit next to the canal. And as we came to the canal, we noticed that it was being drained for its winter use as a skateway, which is a famous sort of Ottawa institution. And as we walked closer and closer, we were sort of troubled by the number of birds that were sitting in the mud, in the muck and the murk at the base of the canal. And as we came closer, we realized, and you can see here in the lower right-hand corner, I've tried to zoom in, we saw all these dead fish. So sunfish and other small freshwater fish that live in the canal and the river. And as we got closer, we realized that the National Capital Commission that takes care of the canal had drained the canal to prepare it, and hadn't taken time to take care of the fish that were within the canal, and just allowed the water to drain away, and hadn't, as far as we could tell, taken the steps to ensure that the fish didn't die. And we noted that as Indigenous folks, many of us, if we fish even one fish over a state mandated quota, we can be criminalized. And this is something that my colleague Crystal Fraser pointed out at a talk she gave at Carleton in early 2016. She said, you know, I'm Gwich'in, and my family are fishermen, and if a Gwich'in or Dene fisherman goes one fish over quota, it's a crime. But if the state, you know, kills 30, 40 fish at this one lock, and we don't know what else was going on in other parts of the canal, it's just tourism, baby. It's just preparing the city for the skateway. And so this was a really upsetting experience that we had. And I returned many times through the next week in October to document the fish that were trapped, including some carp that were trapped deep in the well. You can see in the kind of upper right-hand corner here, right before the lock, that were swimming back and forth and had nowhere to go. And it was a very evocative and painful and troubling experience. So I tweeted about it. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't well connected to any Algonquin colleagues yet. I didn't know who to reach out to. So I tweeted about it. And the following year, and you know, there was some response, but nobody really responded in any meaningful way, especially not from the government or the National Capital Commission. But the following year, I took students back around the same time, and we were pleased to note that there was clear evidence that care was being taken this time. So here you can see there's a dip net, and I'll just quickly play this video. I don't know, I'll just very short clip, just showing we documented again, but this time there was actually enough water for the fish to traverse through as they were draining. And so there was evidence that someone, you know, who knows if it was our advocacy that had helped, but someone was taking care this time. And in that way that Ottawa often operates, often people won't directly speak to you when you raise a concern. People will speak around you, and the only way you'll know that something is happening is that you know, action is taken, and you can surmise that maybe you played a role in helping to shift that conversation, but no one's ever, especially my experience as an Indigenous person has been that nobody's going to credit Indigenous folks for raising these concerns. And so there's kind of an absence and plurality at play there too, that you're sort of spoken around and about, but very, very rarely spoken to, unless you're really, really making settlers uncomfortable or challenging their sovereignty. So I'm just going to wrap up with the 2 minutes I have left before we move on to Monique, who has many brilliant things to share about her work on digital storytelling and Algonquin sovereignty. But the work that we are doing is grounded in this awareness of what Aileen Morton Robinson, who's a Goanpal Indigenous scholar from so-called Australia, calls the white possessive. And in her book from 2015, she cites her uncle, her late uncle Dennis Benjamin Morton, who says, the problem, quote, the problem with white people is they think and behave like they own everything. And I think that that's really what was at play when we came upon the fish dying in the canal, was that they were rendered not relatives, not kin, but objects in the way of the running of the canal, and they were killable. And there's a whole body of theory around rendering certain communities and peoples and beings killable within the settler state. Obviously, like Achille Mbembe's work on necropolitics and others, and who've worked on the biopolitics of this, is really important. So this is just to sort of underscore that we're working in our kind of responses to settler colonial environmental violence, like the killing of fish, through an understanding of the white possessive as a driving desire. And so I'll just pull this quote here of Morton Robinson calls it an excessive desire to invest in reproducing and reaffirming the nation state's ownership, control, and domination over Indigenous peoples, over Indigenous stories, over Indigenous existence. And the question that drives our kind of responses to these kind of environmental violations in Canada and Ottawa, where we are working, but also in other parts of Canada where I have collaborations with other Indigenous communities, is to sort of ask, how do we tell stories with and about place without reinvesting that concept of the white possessive and so-called Canada? And I'm going to hand it over to Monique to sort of talk about how she has built an entire career over many decades of answering that exact question, which is how do we tell our stories without the white possessive? And digital storytelling is a big part of that. It's what has shaped our establishing of the Indigenous Environmental Knowledge Institute at Carleton, which is how we are sort of subtly responding to some of the violations of lands and waters that we see institutions enacting. So Monique.
Miigwech. Thank you, Zoe. Yes, and I'm not on Algonquin territory at the moment, but I am from Algonquin territory, and I would like to say Pajashik, welcome. Welcome to the territory. Welcome to our unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. Kitikanikanish-Bekandojiba. I'm from the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. And I've been so fortunate to work with Zoe to create this institute. It's like a dream come true for me to be able to have this space, and it's a safe space, and it's an Indigenous space where we can reclaim our own storytelling in many forms, in digital form, but also by bringing people into the university. One of the first things we did was we have a land-based course that we're teaching. I believe it's a second-year course that we're teaching. And last winter was our first go-around with it. And what we were looking at doing is taking a look at Ottawa and looking at the Algonquin presence in Ottawa, the historical presence, but also the contemporary presence. Where do you see Algonquin people now? Where do you see evidence of our art, of our people, of our organizations, of our stories, of our legends? Carleton is based right beside the Rideau River, and right across the river in Massey Park, they're now running Indigenous archaeological digs run by Indigenous people who are finding all kinds of evidence of Algonquin people, but also of many other peoples as well, because Ottawa was, of course, a major trading spot. And so there's all kinds of evidence from all kinds of people who came there over the years, 5,000 years ago, to trade and to meet and to discuss. They say Victoria Island was a space where the chiefs would meet to talk about things that affected, issues that affected all of the different nations. And I can't help but thinking that if they're finding those kinds of artifacts right across the river and it's not a very wide river, you can walk across this river, then, what's to say what was at where Carleton now sits? From what I understand, it had been a marshy area. So there would have been, it's a great place for fishing. It's a great place for, birding. It's a great, to me, they're really, it only made sense that there was some evidence, that there would be some evidence there of Indigenous use. And so we asked the students to look at various sites around Ottawa. There's they used to call it Champlain Point. I'm not sure what they're calling it now. It's beside the National Gallery. And that was a lookout place for the Algonquin people. We asked them to report to us about the Algonquin names for the various rivers, for the Ottawa River, for the Gatineau, for the Rideau, for the Mattawa. And we asked them to engage with the area, with Ottawa. I wanted them to see it how I see it. I wanted them to, because I see it as Algonquin territory with a city imposed on top of it. But still there's places where, you know, the culture still sneaks through. It's still there, you know. We never gave up the territory. And when you look at the falls, I mean, the falls, we called them Akakojuan. They were sacred. They were the most sacred space to us in all of our territory. And now they're building condos there. But to have these stories and how that occurred, we are of an age now where we can record these stories digitally. And that, of course, has always been, there's a bit of a conversation around that, whether or not we should be. Because some people say, well, if you record an elder, then they don't, you know, really interact with youth. And I don't know. I think personally, some things should never be recorded. The sacred, it needs to be passed down in the way that our ancestors passed it down. But also, there are so many stories and life experiences. You know, I worked with an elder named Lena Nottoway, or Lena Jerome, and when she was telling a story, it wasn't just her words, it was her facial expressions, it was her hands, it was the glint in her eye. You know, it was the way she told the story that gave it so much meaning and so much context. And so to have that imagery, Jesse Wente from the Indigenous Screen Office calls it digital sovereignty or narrative sovereignty. And I believe that is how we will, I don't know, but the terms indigenize, or I like reclaim. For me, it's a reclamation. It's a way of looking at our territory and reclaiming it, and reclaiming the stories. Even our language is so locative. Places are named for, you know, what can be found there, for events that have occurred there. And when places are clear cut, what happens to the language? So with digital, we're able to reclaim that. We're able to bring that back in to everyday use, bring it back in to the society, to the community, so that we can use it. Another project we're doing with the Indigenous Environmental Knowledge Institute is where I'm actually on my way to. We're going to Newfoundland, and we're going to be working with Flat Bay community, which is an Indigenous community on the west coast of Newfoundland. When the government, the Flat Bay is a known community. There's only one reserve on Newfoundland, it's Conn River. But Flat Bay was always known to be a community, and they have stories, and they are recording these stories. And that's part of what we're going to be doing, is recording these stories of Mi'kma'ki presence there way before contact. But what they did, instead of making Flat Bay a reserve, was they created the Halabu, which is a landless band. So instead of recognizing and acknowledging that this area had been, there had been a Mi'kma'ki presence on this land, they just created this entity, and then, you know, for people to become members of, you know, a First Nation, quote unquote, but there's no land that goes with it. So we're going to be working with them to reclaim their stories. We're actually doing video production, but we're also doing digitization. So where there's language, where there's, you know, all of their ancestral activities are different from ours, because they live by the ocean. It's a different land, it's a different environment, it's a different connection. So we're going to be reclaiming that and bringing that back to life and helping them do that for themselves, and then giving them the skills so they can continue. And then we have the indigitalcultures.ca, which is it's a web space, but for us, it's also a cultural repository. So it's a place where we can share our stories in a safe way. People can, it's up to the individual to, and one of the projects we're also working on is called in digital protocols, where we're speaking to and building relationship with, another reason I'm going in person now that we can, with various communities to find out what are their knowledge transference protocols and how can we pivot those onto indigitalcultures.ca, and how, so that when people engage and interact with the website, they engage in a way that respects those protocols. So when you are engaging with Mi'kma'ki, they have their own protocols. Anishinaabe, Algonquin, we have our own protocols. The Métis have a different protocols. So we're just building it. We're going to launch it in the fall, and we're really hoping that people will be able to share their work, and it'll be a space where we can really build cultural knowledge and engage with the community. So I think that's my time, and I'd like to turn it back over to you. And I know we're going to be having a discussion, so I'm looking forward to that. Thank you, Kachimi Gwitz. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today.
So thank you very much. Zoe, did you have more to say, or?
Oh, no, that's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll just selfishly put a bull throat.
Love that. Love it.
But I'll end there. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ginanos Committee and Monique.
All right, thank you, all three of you, for some fantastic presentations. And just for everyone in the attending the webinar, if you would like to put any questions you have in the chat or in the Q&A field, we will relay them and make sure that they are brought to the attention of the speakers. So I've been taking notes the whole time and was trying to have a question fully prepared, but honestly, you guys have just been focused so much on what you're saying that's hard to think. But what I love is the diversity in what you guys both everyone here has been talking about, but the one commonality here is the idea of the multiple stories, the multiple narratives and perspectives, and not just that, oh, there's all of these narratives, but which ones are silenced and how we ignore some of them sometimes. And I wanted to bring that up as maybe a prompt to start a discussion about what does it mean when we ignore some of the narratives or when we push others. So maybe I'll start, maybe Mark, if you wanted to go first.
Sure, thank you. And Monique and Zoe, thanks. That was a really interesting presentation, especially in your car. So that's great. You know, I was trying to think about some questions as well. I have a number of questions, and so my mind is kind of still in their presentation. But maybe to go back a little bit, one of the narratives that I'm, as a teacher, so I started looking at Darden when I was a student in the years ago, and I used it in my teaching because I thought it was a really, it was an exemplar of drawing. The drawings were beautiful, but it was also like, making of a world. And there was never this idea that you had to then think about a building as something in the world. Your project was your project, and you could really invest in that. And that was important. The way I would approach it now, however, is that it's not about a student having all the answers. It's not about a student like being the genius who's working on an empty slate, but rather it's about, Ricoeur uses this term, the surplus of meaning, and our world is just full of meaning, right? And it's a matter of what you want to kind of unpack and what you want to open up. And so when I use Darden's work in my own teaching now, it's not about a kind of heroic vision. It's about the fact that this really dumb industrial building, which was meant to hold water, can in fact be a whole bunch of other things, right? And our cultures our world is like that, right? Like the land that we are on, I live in an area that was the Hohokam were indigenous there, and the waterways that they produced are still present, right? So the canal system in the valley in Phoenix, Scottsdale, and Tempe are based upon those waterways, right? Like those are ancient. And like if you start thinking about the canal system, you inevitably will get to the Hohokam. And it's like those kinds of things. If you just continually start to unpack things in the world and you look at it from another's perspective, not just your own, that plurality becomes really rich. And so, you know, it's hard because what do you privilege, and you know, whose story again? Like, is it my story to tell? How do you engage with elders? It's not that simple. Like there are sometimes barriers, but I do think that the shift in my own perspective has been, it's less about this idea that one has to have a narrative, and it's much more about sort of engaging in the world around us, which is incredibly rich and has a surplus of meaning that we just have to tap into and kind of uncover. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my jumbled mind is at right now.
Zoe, did you want to add to that? Looked like you had something to say.
Yeah, I think like, and I love, Mark, that you brought up the canals in the territories that you currently live in, because it shows that canals in and of themselves are not good or bad. They are, but it's the ethics and integrity with which they are envisioned, built, and maintained that really can then shape all the other relationships that kind of you know, are entangled with them. And I think that's sort of some of the conclusion I'm coming to in my work by listening to knowledge keepers from many different Indigenous nations across the country, is that it's what you do. So that James Baldwin has this quote from a piece he wrote in 1966 in The Nation, and it's a long essay where he's talking about anti-Black violence and police brutality in Harlem. But at the end, he sort of quotes this song. He says, quote, as the old song says, I can't believe what you say because I see what you do. And that's really been not to co-opt the experience of, you know, African diasporic communities and the violences that have been wrought against, you know, Indigenous peoples from Africa and Black communities in the US and Canada throughout the genocidal periods of the US and Canadian states forming. But that idea of the difference between like what people say and what they do, especially what white colonizers say and do, I think really also gets at that absence and plurality, that you learn to listen for the nuances. You learn to look between the lines and feel between the words and see what, you know, is actually going on. And so that's kind of some of the work that I've been doing, both with Monique, with our institute, but also with my collaborator, Amar Kangiser, who's a sound artist from so-called Australia. And it's really about listening and teaching settlers how to listen to the land and listen to more than human beings and feel what consent feels like. Like, do you have consent to record a soundscape? Do you have permission to sort of work with it? And just getting to that really, because I think a lot of Western European affect and society, like social imaginaries, really override that asking internally, like, should I do this? You know, like, whereas like, you know, the white Christian property owning man, like Sylvia Wynter's idea of like man one that came out of Europe in the 1400s was like, absolutely, I should do it. There's nothing stopping me, right? And I'm being a bit facetious, but like, you know, that other societies have all sorts of protocols around asking and getting consent. And I think like helping settlers to return to that is really key. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but more I'm just like really excited by this conversation because there's so many beautiful sort of like intersections. And I'm really moved by Darden's work. Like just, I had COVID at the start of the pandemic and literally like his oxygen house, like I actually had a physical reaction. I had to stand up and not look at the screen for a bit while you were talking, just because it evoked for me sitting in an attic in the Glebe, which is a very Tony kind of bourgeois part of Ottawa. And I was renting an attic from a wealthy landowner, and having COVID in that space and not going outside for 56 days straight while I couldn't breathe and not having my family to like care for me, like just that was a space for dying. Like I died. Like I think I had a spiritual death in that space and was reborn. And so there's just like but it's just a house. It's just a 1910 era brick house, but so much happened within that space for me. I don't know, and I'm kind of probably going off topic, but I think that those I guess I just really like the idea of we don't know, and it's more about the integrity of how we approach what we don't know that really matters. And the Western Academy hasn't really fostered that, but I love that work like what you just shared today and the work that Monique's doing invite us into that space of not knowing with ethics and integrity and consent.
I wanted to bring in something that Monique was actually talking about, because I feel it connects to what both of you are talking about, but it's the idea of going out and like finding the stories and the connections that are there. So thinking of your the attic, the attic of death, as you put it. So like there's places now to like the last few years too, like that, you know, I no longer work in the basement because I just can't go back down there. It's the same basement. In fact, it looks a lot nicer than it used to, but I can't. And then when Monique, when you were talking about getting the students to go out and find places and then find the information of it, I think that's so important. And then it comes to also not just what's physically there in the book, as Mark was talking about, but like what's in the archives and all of the layers and layers. And maybe I'll turn it to Monique to talk more about that discovering of the more of the narratives, and to remove the absences, I guess, would be how to look at it.
That was part of it. We wanted them to build their own connection to Ottawa. We wanted them to learn in a physical way about the Algonquin presence that is still there, that was and is still there in Ottawa, so that learn to recognize it. And by having them go out and find these stories, in a way, it helps the land to speak for itself. And when you were talking about silencing stories, what you silence is history. What is silenced is living, breathing presence within the territory. You know, when I talk about the language being locative, we literally call it language of the land, because it ties us to the environment. And I'm seeing that it's so different coming out here, out east, because I'm not in my own territory. It's still Anishinaabe territory, but it's not my territory. I am a guest here. And I have a different approach when I speak to the elders, when I speak to the artists. It's not, I become a facilitator of voice. Whereas in my own territory, it's my responsibility to tell some stories and not tell others. I'm given permission from my community to share. I've been gifted stories, and it's important that I help to champion my nation, to make people aware of our knowledge and our presence. Whereas here, my responsibility is to create a space so that they can tell their story and to get out of the way. But you know, with the camera and with the microphone and with the tape, I can help them, you know, not even help them, facilitate it, create the space. It makes for a place where they can tell their own story. So it's you know, it's really about bringing those stories to life, I guess, and reclaiming the space. So thank you. I really enjoyed this today. It's been a wonderful, wonderful panel.
Can I add something really quickly to that? Like, sure. One of the threads that's kind of running through this for me that's really important is representation in some way, and it relates to what you just said, and it relates to the digital, because I think that there are standards for. I'm an architect. So there are standards on how you represent something, and yet, like, if I were to draw my office, for example, in where I work, that office was not my office 20 years ago, and that office has witnessed all of these amazing things, and there are stories in that office that we don't see in a representation that might be quote unquote objective, like an elevation or a axonometric of some sort. And so, like, one of the interesting things about Darden's work for me originally was the representation, because it was so rich, but it also included artifacts like letters and instructions and directions, really, all these things. So in some ways, I think about your comment about the relationship of place and story and language, and like that when you clear cut or you add condos, like that changes the relationship of that language. Like the spoken word changes because the place is different. So how is that when you're telling stories, when you're recounting stories, like how is that represented? And it could be, I don't know, I don't know enough about it, but it seems like there could be different modalities of representation that might approximate the relationship of language and place, if that makes sense.
Well, it certainly changes the language. Absolutely. There is a place there, they called it the pipe bowl. There was a whirlpool, and that has been completely destroyed because of Quebec Hydro. They built the dam right over it, so you can't even see it anymore. So that, well, we know it was called that.
Monique, you accidentally got muted. Can you repeat what you said after
Oh,
the
sorry. Yeah.
pipe bowl got removed? Oh, you're muted again. Okay.
Oh, I'm muted again. Is that better?
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay. So yeah, it does. When locales change, it changes the language. In order for those stories not to be erased, you have to keep that language that was connected to that place alive. You have to uncover those stories and bring them back to life. Thanks.
It's interesting that you bring up language, and it actually, I think, maybe prompts a question that was asked in the audience by Paul Emmons, who said, thanks to the organizers and the excellent talks from the presenters, I'm wondering how we understand our use of the word stories. Does it become so broad that it can include any thought? Are there cultural differences, say with the Algonquin language, that give unique meanings to the words for story? So I'll pass it along. I'm not sure if someone wants to take a stab at the question first. Zoe?
I'll take a stab, yeah, but I can't answer the Algonquin part. I wouldn't presume to know the sort of the protocols and philosophy around Algonquin stories. But I think as I have come to understand stories, and I was raised by a settler journalist and a Métis artist, and so stories have played, and my several of my family members are Indigenous filmmakers. Like story is really central to our family and how we are. We tell stories. Lots of stories. And I think, for me, I think a story, it's like a very human impulse. Like as Mark said at the beginning, we all tell stories. So I think that there are pluralities of ways we can understand them. I think that stories, we could maybe say on like a psychological perspective, like stories are how we make sense of things that are happening in the world around us. And so I think sometimes thought can be story because we are storying it through the perspective of our being in the world and our interpretation of phenomena in the world. But they have different meanings across different cultures. And obviously like Western society for a long time downplayed story as a rational, logical, objective form of knowledge creation and transfer. But we're coming back to it. And I think also like at the same time, while Western society was downplaying oral history, it still really, was hanging on to its own forms of oral history that it just codified as law and philosophy. and there's a lot of like storytelling that happens in those spaces that is like quite fanciful, but, is taken as very serious business. And what I really enjoy about Indigenous storytelling traditions, at least those I've experienced in so-called Canada, is that there can be both gravity and also humor, and there can be grief and there can be rage, there can be everything all at once, and those are valuable like experiences. They can be really cathartic, and so I don't know if I'm answering the question completely, but I think that anyways, my aunt Loretta Todd, who's a Métis filmmaker, she works really closely with Leroy Little Bear, and she does augmented and virtual reality work here on the West Coast, and training youth and community members how to use those tools. And Leroy Little Bear has taught her that like Indigenous peoples have always used virtual reality, like through ceremony and other aspects. We have created realities beyond the physical realm. And I think, that prompted me to write, like stories were kind of our first virtual reality in some ways, because you were able to evoke place, time, and relationships through words, through song, through expressions, and evoke that for people. And I think it's sort of a beautiful thing. Even Europeans tell stories and do it really beautifully and powerfully and evocatively. And so I think it's one of those things that connects us all as humans. So I really like how, Mark, how you opened up with saying that the two things all of us do is build and tell stories. Yeah, I'll leave it there though.
The one thing that I in my own life I keep coming back to is that I do think that we all tell stories. It's how we make sense of the world. Every culture has stories on how the sun rises and sets and how we were, our origin stories. We all have those in every culture. And I think that's really great, in a lot of ways. I think it's always fascinating to sort of learn about other cultures in that way. Where it gets a little tricky for me, and this is where I kind of want to open up the question of story and maybe history. History and story are connected. Ricoeur argues that the difference has to do with facticity, this idea that something can be verified, that we communally as a group, we can agree that something happened here and now as opposed to then and there. And in the past, I would say, 10, 15 years, like our political world that's out the window, right? And so in a way, we've returned to a kind of oral story, and that is fed through Twitter and through Instagram and through rallies and all these other things, Facebook, and the story of what happened, for example, on January 6th is on the spectrum, right? I mean, and on one hand, it's one thing, on the other hand, it's another thing. And for me, it's really difficult. Like, I think we've lost a kind of sensus communis where we can actually agree that at least there was, in this construct of political world, something happened, and that isn't, I don't think we were there. And so this is what sort of troubles me about a kind of return to story, because everything's a story, right? And our constant news story and, your feed of news, if you're, whatever it is so filtered that it's troubling, it's really, really troubling.
And is that why, Mark, you say that the plurality becomes a problem? Is that why you were saying that when you finished your presentation?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt just a second because Monique unfortunately has to depart at the moment. I just wanted to say thank you very much, Monique, for coming today. Even if you're joining us literally on the road, it means a lot for us to join and hear your stories today.
Thank you, Monique.
Safe driving now.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I have an interview. I'm about to go collect stories with Catherine Martin. She's actually an international awarded Indigenous filmmaker. And she's a real storyteller. And so my time I'm in Atlantic, and so I'm not, my timing is a bit off today because I'm 3:08, so I don't know what time it is anywhere else in the world.
Well, thank you very much for being here.
I'm going to go look up more, Mark, about what you were saying, and Zoe, always a wonderful pleasure. And we should talk soon, and I really appreciate being here today. Thank you. Kachimi good. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. So Mark, I don't remember what Pallavi just asked you, so maybe she can repeat. Right.
She was asking about the problematic nature of like multiple narratives, and in one hand, I think it's like, I don't think it's an either or situation. Like, we have multiple narratives coexisting in place all the time, right? And what we choose to privilege or how we choose to privilege is present all the time. The issue for me is when that gets raised to such a level where, I'll give you a quick example, like the environmental issues that we face the political impact on environmental issues have more impact than anything. So if India, Brazil, Russia, China, and the United States don't believe in global warming, we're done. We're not going back. And that's a political thing. That's not an environmental thing, right? And so it's really troubling that all of these different narratives seem to coexist. Yet on the other hand, I recognize that multiple narratives need to exist, right? It's part of our life and how we coexist. So yeah, and it's not something I have an answer to. It's something that I would love to hear more perspective on, because I find it really difficult.
I have thoughts.
Please.
No, and I think you've really honed in on this struggle within we're living in the aftermaths, most immediately the last 600 years of a white supremacist colonial capitalist worldview that has shaped our social relations. Capital has shaped our material relations. And I think that what I have learned through, and I wouldn't say that I'm an expert, I would never claim I'm an expert on this. I only know the little bit that I know, but from spending time with Indigenous knowledge keepers like Monique and others, like the protocols with which stories are shared in Indigenous contexts are tied to our legal orders, which are tied to collective ways of generating knowledge. And there's an integrity piece that I think Western society, when it broke away from the sort of the divine right of kings, and yes, like European sort of peasants were being treated brutally by their leaders. And so there was a reason why they developed this idea of man and human rights that eventually came out. But the individuality that came out of their particular traumas has trumped all other sort of collective responsibilities. And so a lot of Indigenous folks, including a wonderful, brilliant student I worked with, Alaka Ilauk, talks about how from an Inuit perspective, there isn't like a human rights necessarily within an Inuit legal orders. There are human responsibilities, and it's a responsibility-based legal order. And a lot of non-Western, non-imperialist societies have similar ideas that rights are useful because we're fighting against supremacist societies that have dehumanized people. And so this isn't to dismiss human rights. They're very important. But that other piece that is missing from a Western concept of rights is the responsibility piece. And, you can tell any story you want in an Indigenous context, in a Métis context, like my own nation. I could say, this, and happen. And there will be 5 people within my own family who will say, well, actually, I remember this happening. And no single narrative ever really should or could sort of trump the collective narrative. And, there's tensions in that, and it's complicated, but sort of the legal approach, the norms and protocols applied, when someone tells a story, often you will hear an Indigenous storyteller say, I learned this story from so-and-so. And that's so people can go back and say, okay, well, I know that person, that's my grandma's cousin. Yep, she was alive then. Yep, it's quite probable that she actually saw that. Okay, that checks out. But I think that we are in this like sort of post-truth Western fascist space in the US and in Canada as well. We had not January 6th, but a year later, we had the convoy in Ottawa, and it was a truthiness convoy, like the affect and the feeling and the emotions that white people feel about their so-called oppression in this country. You can't counter the emotion because they are feeling it in their bodies. But is it true? Like, is it true that they're being oppressed? I would say no. Being asked to take a vaccine is not the same thing as experiencing 600 years of brutal genocidal policy. So I think you're really getting at, we're stuck in this individualist framework. And so everyone thinks that they have a right to sort of be their own expert, et cetera. But so many other societies from very long periods of time balance that individual sort of existence with collective responsibility as well. And I think that's what's lost especially experiences living in the UK, US, and Canada. That collective piece is just so absent. And so the pluralities, and I guess it just like, I think what fascism does well is it plays on emotion. And you can't argue with an emotion, right? Because it is felt in the body, whether it's true or not, it's felt in the body. And I don't know how we move past it, but it is troubling, because I don't really know how we get past it other than kind of leaning into this thoughtful, integral, ethical balancing of rights and responsibilities. And the responsibility piece is just like, someone like Trump, he's not thinking about his responsibilities because he's just living in that affective space of himself being the victim all the time. And yeah, so I guess, anyways, this could go off the rails, but I think that there's a sort of there's an emotional, psychological component that has been created as a centering, angry white men like Trump or others as a objective viewers of their experience, and we can't counter them because they are literally the face of logic and rationality and reason, when in fact they are very irrational and illogical and unreasonable. But we can't, the tools we have right now in this current Western society don't really allow us to counter it. And I don't know how we get through it other than to just keep really working collectively to push back against their truthiness. Anyways, I don't know. It's a really provocative and important question.
On that note, so Mark, I wanted to ask you specifically, because you were doing the archival research, and architecture in itself represents, but also through drawings and, the fiction that you were bringing in the letters and so on, there's a kind of an overlay of so many factors in the example that you just shared with us. Do you think that's a plurality, or it's just that was intended, or is it something that is the nature of architecture?
That's a good question. I saw Barin's comment as well in the chat, and maybe I can try to tie those together. What's curious to me is that Darden would try to mask every project. So what is presented in the book in Condemned Building is a series that all the projects have models, all the drawings are shown in 2 dimensions. So it's always a plan or a section. There are no perspective. There's actually just one perspective of a very old project. But nothing is given, or there's a kind of very similar presentation of all the work. And then when you look at it, it sort of reminds me of a monograph of a 1980s architecture office, where they just the facts, like these are the buildings, this is the area, square footage, program, whatever. They just want to, but they don't tell you how much it costs. They don't tell you the contractor. They don't tell you the who was displaced or anything. Like nothing else is given, right? Like there's this kind of sheen of clarity over the whole thing. And yet he drops in Hamlet quotes, and he drops in references to Victor Hugo and all these other people that are kind of in that world of architecture and storytelling. And so, there's something else there, but it's not given. And then I think the most interesting thing for me is that when you do start to kind of unpack it, everything is super autobiographical. There's a museum of imposters in the book, and that project began because Darden was living in a farmhouse in Maryland, and there was a bunch of like stuff in it, and he found a newspaper clipping of a woman who claimed to be the sister of the Queen, when in fact she was the first white slave in the United States, and she was an imposter, and she like made a lot of money doing this, and this was this one piece of paper that he found in a barn that he was living in, and that opened up to a whole bunch of other projects. It literally created the project. And this idea that America is based upon imposters, right? Like we're not really who we say we are necessarily. And when you leave one country and you come to another land, you create a whole history of your own, and you disregard everything else. And so he's trying to tie an artifact into a bigger narrative, into his own personal narrative. And in a way, I find that kind of that story, the backstory, much, much, much more interesting, because it decenters the projects, because the projects are so nice and tidy, nice and clean. So I don't see them necessarily as separate, because they're together, they're related. But it's much more interesting to me to sort of see the kind of personal narrative evolve, and literally like where he went from Boston to Baltimore, New York, New Jersey, Denver, Rome, back to Denver. And all the projects are like, they follow him in a way, and it's not random. They're really intentional. So I hope that answered your question, Barry, and I'm not sure, let's talk offline about it some other time, but I do really appreciate that there's another really interesting story happening behind all of it.
Thank you. Katie, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Sometimes my mic doesn't work. I wanted to bring up the point that was made earlier about like it's not not about telling other people's stories, but about like facilitating their ability to tell stories. I know it was something Monique's talked about, but I think we can probably talk about it too. And that as well with the idea that not all things should become digitized. Some things should become still in the realm of like, live and person to person. And so it kind of comes to the idea of who is facilitating the story, like the space for the stories to be told. Because I think this is maybe one of a huge limitation, because it's where the money is, where the facilitation happens, and then therefore how can we make sure the right stories or all the stories or are told, and that we're not silencing things just by following them where the money is, if that makes sense.
I can jump in. I think, the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is just thinking about how, Mark, you described Darden as making this oxygen house, building this through all of his engagements. And it turns out that he himself is dying of cancer and his lung is collapsing. And I think that sometimes there's an ephemerality to stories that they will find a way to be told. Which isn't to say that structurally certain things can prevent even those stories from being told. But I do think that sometimes there's just some stories that just want to be told and they find a way, and they come through. And I think there's not a lot of space in Western academic context to really talk about the sort of agency that stories have often, because it just is so counter to kind of this idea of the sort of rational way that we come to think and then act. But the other question about how do we make sure we aren't silencing stories? I have a really good friend who works in a very sort of elite academic context who says their job is to liberate the ill-gotten funds of the institution. And I really like that idea. And I've really taken it to, as soon as she said it to me, I was like, oh, that's my job too. I have to help get with whatever tools I have, often through narrative, often through telling a story that makes it compelling in one way or another for an institution to release funds. That's my job. I can do that as a tenured professor. And so I see it as my responsibility with sort of every opportunity I have to kind of get money, and then make sure I don't hold on to that money. Like if I, that money should go to students, to community members. And I really believe in hiring folks who don't fit the normal criteria of like academic kind of spaces. So finding ways to fund projects that maybe are illegible to the granting agencies or to the institution, but finding creative ways, telling stories in ways that make them as legible as we need them to be to get the funding. And so that's kind of like a lot of the work I do is creative narrative sort of framing with integrity and ethics and grounding, but just really finding ways to sort of like a fish, I guess, kind of move through the dams and blockages that these institutions have put up and sort of say like, okay, like really our responsibility is to make sure that like grandmas and aunties and youth and others can get out on the land. What do we need to do to make that legible to a funding agency? We know that lots of important information will be generated there. Yeah, so that's kind of, I've taken that to heart and I'm doing it as best as I can, but other people are teaching me lots of important approaches as well. And I'm really lucky to work with good people who do that work. Yeah, but I think sometimes folks can get into the academy and they get caught up in a scarcity mindset and competition. And they think like, oh, I have to, like sort of like I don't know, a character from The Hobbit, like a dragon, like I must, guard this with my life, but actually like, just let it flow. There'll be more funding if we work together collectively. So that I try to keep that mindset and keep my ego as much as I can out of it. And just like this is about making sure that the folks who could use this well get it. And that's been a really important lesson for me.
Katie, can I reframe that question? Because
of course, yeah.
I think it's actually maybe also about getting above the noise, because there's so much going on, right? Like, so I was on a tenure review committee years ago and someone made the comment that, yeah, this person wrote a book, but Paris Hilton has 5 books. Like, you know, and I don't really know Paris Hilton, and she's probably a wonderful human being, but like, if that's our measure, like, is that really appropriate? Like, is that like meaningful anymore? If we talk about influence, I was, again, another tenure review committee. There was a professor up for tenure or up for a promotion, and she listed as impact the fact that a house she designed in Joshua Tree was the most requested Airbnb in the United States. And I'm like, that's pretty cool, right? That means something, I suppose, right? I don't know. You know, how many people follow Kim Kardashian on Instagram, right? The most lucrative YouTube person, I think he's now 10 or 12, but he opened up gifts. He opened up toys. He made $27 million a few years ago. Like, that's just crazy, you know? Like, so when we talk about influence and we talk about impact, and like, these are things that are part of our culture in higher education, like, how do we get above the noise? And how do we actually, like, maybe we really need to radically rethink some of these things. If a book is considered impactful, like, really, like, how so? You know what I mean? Like, how do you measure the impact of a community project? Like, you don't right now, because it doesn't have any, it's not in a journal, it's not in, you know, it doesn't get cited, it doesn't, all the measures of impact are strange, right? So right now in my university, if you get a grant, the grant's impact is the amount of money it is. So $1 million grant is more impactful than a $500,000 grant, and a $10 million grant is even more so. And that, there's no, like, that impact could be me studying, you know, 3D printed concrete by myself in a laboratory, you know, and so I think there's like a system that we have in higher education that needs to be disrupted first. And the second is really, how do we get above the noise of pop culture and really try to engage? I mean, we don't have public intellectuals anymore, you know, like that, it's kind of gone away, and we have influencers. And that from, it's like a weird framing. So I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways we could go the route of becoming an influencer, like to become an intellectual influencer, maybe. I don't know that I don't know. Maybe that's possible. I'm not sure, but I don't know how we get above the noise would be my kind of response to your question, if that makes sense.
I really like the idea of like getting above the noise, because it has many layers. So I think at this point, what I can do, this has been a really good conversation, so we've been having. Is there anything, Mark, that you want to ask Zoe, or Zoe that you would like to ask Mark?
I'm just grateful. I'm going to be thinking about Oxygen House all day. Just, yeah, that kind of speculative space. Yeah, and I do think, I'll just say that I think architecture is actually one of the spaces where I think that building and those stories come together. And so I think that paradoxically, even though some architecture in the past has been used towards colonial ends, I still think that idea of like, it's neither good nor bad, it's how we use it that matters. And I think that I love working with architects for this reason. It's why I've partnered with them on almost every project, because there's some of, like, architects, you are some of the most creative and sort of expansive thinkers that I've come across in the academy. So I just want to express my gratitude at sort of the opportunity to share space with you all today. Yeah.
I very much appreciate that, and I would sort of mirror that back. I was hoping to hear more about the perspective of the trout. I was looking for that, but I really appreciate the relationship that you've, and when you talked about between language, place, and identity, these sorts of things. And I think especially talking about indigeneity, there's like, it opens up so many possibilities, so many questions, because in my own experience, I grew up in a way that there's a lot of assumptions that are made about how we understand landscape, how we understand our world, really. And it's unpacking that it's a lot, and it's work that needs to be done, but it takes a lot of work. And I really appreciate the stories that you brought today. So thank you.
Well, I wanted to say a big thank you to both of you. It's been some amazing talks. I'm definitely going to be looking at, well, everything from like buildings to areas in Ottawa differently for the next little while. And one thing that really was interesting was the idea of language too, that Mark, you just brought up too, but Monique brought up as well. and just how powerful language can be, and just to take back certain meanings and and express more. Pallavi, before we fully wrap up, do you have anything you want to say?
Definitely a big thank you to all three of you, Mark, Zoe, and Monique. And I think all of us are going home with lots of thoughts in our minds. I do hope we can capture this somewhere also in the form of a publication. So we'll be reaching out to you about that. But thank you for all the great ideas that you brought to the table today. And I just wanted to remind all our audiences and you as well that we have another session coming up next week on July 14th. And we hope we can see you there. But there's been a wonderful train of thoughts that probably is interwoven into all these sessions, and some common arguments and thoughts that are being presented, but from different perspectives. And we'll see how it turns out. But again, thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Enjoy your week. See you soon.
Thank you. Ginanas Komitin.